It's the high summer garden tour, and the roses and the lavender are both looking fab in this garden. So I've got some tips on how you can keep your roses and lavender looking good. And also a few little problems like, have your flowers distorted? What to do if your variegated plants have suddenly thrown up some green shoots? And really, what can you do about bindweed? It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and it's the Summer Garden Tips and Tour. I'll put links into the description below with any resources I mention, and also with timestamps so you can jump to the particular tip you want. And if you're new here, the Middlesized Garden uploads once a week with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. So if you'd like to see those videos when you open up YouTube, then click the subscribe button. They're absolutely free. And if you want YouTube to tell you when a new video is uploaded, then tap the notifications bell. The Middlesized Garden is a walled town garden, and it's 100 feet long. It's about 80 feet wide at its widest, but it's an L shape, so it's 40 feet wide nearer the house. And we roughly equate to a USDA hardiness zone of 9. And that is because in southeast England, our winters are quite mild. We rarely go below -6 Celsius, 23 Fahrenheit. But our summers aren't as warm, usually, as summers in a zone 9. However, for the last week or so, we have been having what we would call a heat wave, which is about 28 degrees Celsius, about 84 Fahrenheit. And that's come as quite a shock to us. But what we had just before that was an awful lot of rain. And this combination of rain and sun has really got the garden going. And of course, top of the list of what's got going is weeds. By the way, it's rather windy today, so do excuse the wind noise that's going on in the background. I've decided that weeding is one of those things like sweeping the kitchen floor. It's really something that no matter how you design your garden or what methods you use, you will always have to weed. Everybody has their own special tips on how you can reduce weeding in your garden. And I've pulled all those together in a no-nonsense guide to weeding video, which you'll find in the description below. But the important thing to remember is that no matter what you use, you will have to weed. Even if you concrete over your garden or you use fake turf. There's fake turf in a couple of the front gardens nearby. They've been in for a couple of years. They've all got weeds. Weeds are blown in on the wind from miles away, and birds drop weed seeds, and those also come from miles away. So it's not just about what your neighbour's doing or not doing in the garden. And if you put something like a horticultural membrane down, that will suppress the perennial weed seeds for a while, but they crawl around. They go under a horticultural membrane, they go under concrete, they go under stone, and they pop up a few feet away. For example, in this corner, I put a horticultural membrane out the whole of last summer to try to get rid of the bindweed that was there and also the ground elder. And I got it completely clear. It looked as if there was nothing left, and it had been covered for a whole summer. I haven't checked this corner for a few weeks, literally, I suppose, 2 weeks since I looked at it closely. And in that time, we've had rain and we've had sun. And in spite of this being a border where there was apparently no bindweed, there is this pile of bindweed. I've taken it out as soon as I saw it, even in the middle of filming, because if you see a weed and you just pull it out, even though you know there are lots of other weeds in the garden, but if you just pull it out when you see it, because you'll never get it all out, it's no good thinking, I'll leave that until Saturday and I'll do a good weeding session, because it'll be 3 times the size on Saturday. Apparently, ultimately, that will weaken the roots, but I have to say there's no bindweed roots around here that look as if they're weakening in any way whatsoever. But actually, weeding can be quite immersive in your garden. You get to know your garden, and it can be quite meditative. So perhaps just let's change our minds about weeding as opposed to try and pretend we're never going to have to do it, or that we can find a final solution. The lavender is absolutely at its peak now in high summer. And lots of people ask me how I manage to keep it looking so tight in its shape, how I stop it sprawling and getting leggy. This lavender is now 11 years old. I planted it in 2010. And I also planted a big bank of lavender lining one of the beds. I had to get rid of this because I started off taking the advice that I'd read online and in books about pruning lavender, which was to trim lightly, which was never cut into the wood, and which was to leave at least 1/3 of new growth on it. And my lavender just sprawled and got leggy. Now, not all lavender will do this. If you've got French lavender with the ears, that has a different pruning type. And also, there are different types of lavender. But my lavender was transformed when I came across the hard pruning method. And once again, there are different ways of explaining that. It can be cut your lavender down to 9 inches above the ground. It can be trimmed so that you've just got a few new shoots showing. But the basic thing to remember is that lavender doesn't regenerate from old wood. But if you look at your lavender and you look down really closely, you'll see tiny little grey specks quite close to the ground, and those are little shoots. So as long as you trim above that, you should be all right. We've tried trimming with secateurs, with shears and with a strimmer, and we've done it quite hard. But they all seem to work reasonably well. And there's a blog post about how to trim your lavender in the description below. And that's how I have trimmed this lavender since 2014. It is now getting a little bit woody and leggy, but it's got a while to go. I'm going to regenerate it actually by trying to cut it back even harder this year. And if that doesn't work, if it dies, then I'll get a new plant, because if you don't like the way your lavender looks, then actually you might as well try hard pruning. If it dies, you'll just have to get a new plant. If you're happy with the way you prune your lavender at the moment, carry on, because gardening is very much about finding the tips and ideas that work for you and finding your own gardening style. The other thing I am really pleased with at the moment is the roses. Last year I interviewed Neil Miller of Hever Castle Gardens about how to look after roses. And I realised that I hadn't really been feeding my roses enough. I always add a layer of garden compost or well-rotted manure to my soil in autumn. And for most plants, that level of feeding is enough. But roses are athletes. They pump out gorgeous flowers time after time, or they will if you feed them extra. So everyone I know who has roses in a mixed border usually adds an extra feed. It can be a rose fertiliser, it can be a seaweed fertiliser, or it can be an all-purpose fertiliser. Just read the instructions on the packet so you give the right amount. And this is what I've been doing this year, and I can see the roses have really benefited. They're a big splash of colour in the garden. And the other important thing is to keep deadheading. If you see the rose flower dying, just snip it off. If you see a cluster of roses dead or dying, snip down to the nearest leaf junction. You may, of course, have chosen your rose because you particularly want some hips, rose hips in the winter. And if that's the case, of course, don't deadhead it. But otherwise, the more you deadhead your roses, the more flowers you'll get. And I'd suggest doing that every day, not once a week. There is one problem in the rose border, however. I've been looking for a particular rose called Harry Wheatcroft for several years now, and I've twice ordered it from companies, but the rose that has arrived has not been Harry Wheatcroft, which is a yellow and pink striped rose. I've been given a pink rose, which is called Gaujard, which actually is very pretty and I like it, and a white and pink striped rose, which I really don't know the name of. Wrong labelling is relatively common in the horticultural industry, especially as so many plants look the same once they're dormant. So if a plant doesn't turn out the way you thought it was, it's probably not your mistake, it may well be the nursery's mistake. And if it worries you, do take it back to them. Now, here's a really tricky problem. We had a cold, wet spring, and when my Veronicastrum came out, the flowers seemed incredibly distorted. I mean, to an extent that really quite worried me. So I put some photographs on social media and asked people what they thought. And Sian James Cameron of Sian's Garden came back to me with a blog post on fasciation, or it could be fasciation. Anyway, it looks like fascination but without the N. And this is something that happens in plants. It's a kind of freak event. It can be caused by a virus, it can be a bacteria, or it can be the result of a cold, wet spring. And Veronicastrum is particularly vulnerable. In fact, people have said that they've seen Veronicastrum with fasciation in actually RHS Bridgewater. And of course, if it's good enough for the RHS, it's good enough for me. I had wondered whether I would have to dig up my plants and get rid of them if it was a virus, but other gardeners advised me not to, because if you dig plants out of a border at this stage, it's going to be very difficult to avoid damaging the other plants around it. And the other thing with fasciation is that apparently it may just happen in 1 year. Next year, these Veronicastrum could come back looking like they did last year, which you can see here. Also in the main border, I've carried on doing a bit of tweaking. For example, spent allium heads look really good as an outline for a few weeks, but then suddenly they start to look really nothingy and they just get in the way of how things look. So I just pull them out as I'm going past. And if plants are encroaching on each other, don't hesitate to snip some of them back, like this rose which is encroaching on the canna that's popped up beside it. Just a bit of snipping here and there, even if it's not at the right time for pruning, will just tidy up the garden and make it look better. Now here's an interesting problem, and a variegated and euonymus silver queen. Variegation means that the leaves are multicoloured. They might be green and yellow or white and green, and this silver queen has got a very pretty leaf, but there are some all green leaves appearing on specific branches. If this happens to your variegated plant, you must cut it out as soon as you see it. If you let the green take over, then the whole plant may revert to green. A few months ago, I told you about a difficult shady corner we had where a pergola had collapsed. And in the end, we decided to plant it up simply, adding a tree and some shrubs and some shade-loving plants, and to put tables and chairs there. So I bought a very young tree, a silver birch, and planted it, and it's growing incredibly well. It's a useful tip to know. When you buy very young trees, they do get established much more quickly. So if your choice is spending a lot of money on a mature tree, you will have to plant that much more carefully and really look after it for 2 or 3 years afterwards. If you buy a young tree, then you've got a much better chance of it getting established, and very often the growth will catch up. It is important, if you've planted trees or shrubs this year, to make sure that you water them in summer, because they haven't got the root system to get the water from deep down in the ground. And for trees, you may have to water them for 2 summers. After that, most plants in your garden should be able to deal with your usual weather. You can probably see behind me that the lawn is looking very shaggy. The lawnmower is broken and it's off for the repairers. And we will go back to mowing once it comes back, but we do only mow once every 2 weeks, and we do let a few flowers grow so that they're there for pollinators. The no-mow look is certainly getting more popular, and it's really helpful for wildlife. But I think this is something that's very much a question of how you like to do it in your garden. And well, this is how the shaggy look looks here. You can catch up with the other garden tours and tips in the playlist at the end of this video. So if there's any particular aspect of gardening you'd like to hear more about, then let me know. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.